Part 1, the London programme Children in Care, production number 20004, date recorded 17th of January 1980, take 1.
Drugs like these are used on political prisoners in the Soviet Union. Now there's growing concern that they're also being widely used in Britain. Not on prisoners, but on children in the care of local councils. Good evening. Until quite recently, there was no real question about what society ought to do with children who misbehaved. They were simply punished. And if they misbehaved very badly, they were locked up in institutions, which would, it was hoped, drum some sense into them. But for the past 10 years or so, a different approach has been tried. As psychiatry developed as a medical science, and as more and more sophisticated drugs were developed, so the more liberal notion grew that delinquency is not so much a crime that should be punished, as a condition that can, with the right treatment, be cured. In tonight's programme, we examine whether or not we've got it right. Stephen Scott reports.
On November the 3rd last year, in the Kent village of Forkham Green, Pamela Mould and Brian Butcher were married. For 19-year-old Pamela, the wedding was a triumph in itself. Only 3 years ago, she was being kept behind locked doors in a children's home. She was disruptive and often violent, and she faced the possibility of spending much of her life in secure institutions. At the age of 13, after a difficult childhood, Pamela had been taken into care by the local authority.
My parents got rather tired of me being brought home by the police quite frequently, which in the end got to twice a week, possibly. Then, on a voluntary basis, I was taken into care for 3 weeks or so until they decided what they were going to do. Then, after about a week of being in care, I was then found smashing a station window, and then I was taken into care by a court of law order.
While she was in care, Pamela was given powerful drugs to curb her violent behaviour. Some psychiatrists believe that the use of such drugs is the only way to deal with problem children. No one knows for certain how many problem children like Pamela there are in local authority care in Britain. In the London area, the figure's probably something over 200. And it's these children who present the system with its greatest difficulties. There are just over 100,000 children in care in England and Wales, 19,000 of them in the care of the London boroughs. Some of the inner London boroughs take far more children into care than any other councils in the country. In 1977, the latest year for which figures are available, for every 1,000 children under 18, Camden Council took into care 20.6. In Hackney, the figure was 21.4, and in Tower Hamlets, 31.3. That's almost 2.5 times the figure for Liverpool, and the figure for Birmingham was even lower. Another day at Middlesex Lodge in Hillingdon. Middlesex Lodge is one of 3 regional assessment centres for girls in the London area. There are 3 more for boys. Through these and smaller local assessment centres are channelled all the London children taken into care. The powers given to local authorities to take children into care are laid down in a number of Acts of Parliament. Most children are taken into care voluntarily, perhaps, for example, because their parents are ill, or homeless, or in the middle of an unpleasant divorce. Others are taken in compulsorily, under a care order, because, for example, their parents are ill-treating them. Only about 20% will have been taken into care because they've committed a criminal offence. The girls at Middlesex Lodge are observed and assessed over a period of 6 to 8 weeks before being sent to a more permanent home. The local authority has almost absolute power to place a child where it thinks fit. Of the 100,000 children presently in care, Roughly 35% will be fostered. 26% will be in children's homes, run directly by the local authority or voluntary or private agencies. A further 6% will be sent to community homes with education, that's the old approved schools, and the rest are either allowed to go home or are in more specialised units. The theory is that a child will be found a home to meet his or her needs. The reality is that for the older and more difficult child, this often proves impossible. Some of them will end up being moved from home to home, becoming increasingly disruptive.
I think it's true and regrettable that there are failures of the childcare system. I think one has to bear in mind that they may well be failures before they ever come into the childcare system. And the sort of problems that residential staff have to cope with in terms of the verbal abuse and even physical abuse from these children are very taxing on the staff. Now, if you get a home which is perhaps understaffed, it is relying on comparatively inexperienced staff, it's not difficult to see that you can easily get an explosive situation, and a point may be reached where that home can no longer care with the problems of that young person.
It's children like these, severely disturbed and often violent, who are most likely to be subjected to treatment with drugs, although few of them have been diagnosed as having specific mental disorders. Dr. Colin Brewer is a consultant psychiatrist who works at Middlesex Lodge. He described for us the drugs most often used.
The drug in the two nearest ampules is Modicate, and the other ampoule is Dipixol. They're both very similar drugs. The orange tablet is a sort of tablet version of Modicate. The blue one is Stelazine, which is quite commonly used, as is the haloperidol, the pink one. These are all used primarily in the treatment of schizophrenia. They can certainly be used for calming, but you need very high doses, and you tend to get rather unpleasant side effects at that sort of dose. I don't think it's being too melodramatic to say it is this group of drugs which has been strongly criticised by many bodies, including our own Royal College of Psychiatrists, in its use by the Russians and perhaps other regimes for giving to people who are not schizophrenic, simply in order to keep them quiet, which it will certainly do if you give it in high enough doses. It also can cause very unpleasant side effects in high doses.
These drugs are not, in fact, used at Middlesex Lodge, and no one knows precisely how often they are given to severely disturbed children elsewhere. But Ron Lacey, the co-author of a new book on children in care, believes many psychiatrists regularly prescribe them.
I think it's probably now common knowledge that drugs are being widely used to control children. In terms of quantifying the problem, that's very, very difficult, in that it's usually done by one doctor with one child. And I think that is also a serious problem. In the book, we are calling for an inquiry into the extent of the use of these drugs. And I think the sorts of issues we would want to know is we want to know who is being prescribed the drugs, in what quantities, and for what specific diagnoses.
In March of last year, before the general election, Dr. Gerard Vaughan, now Minister of Health, expressed his concern about the use of these drugs on children in care. He said, "I'm afraid that far too often drugs are given to a child, not for his own sake, but simply to quieten him down. This year, the year of the child, a long, hard look should be taken at how we treat our problem children." And now, in the London area, local authorities like Kensington and Chelsea Council are also becoming increasingly worried about the issue. One of the places that has given rise to this concern is this home for girls in Gravesend. Kendall House is run by a Church of England group, the Canterbury and Rochester Diocesan Council for Social Responsibility. The doors at Kendall House are locked. It specialises in dealing with very disturbed girls aged from 10 to 16. Some of them are there for several years.
On the whole, they've moved around quite a bit, and they tend to come here because either they're very aggressive or they appear very depressed and are needing specialist help that way. They don't fit in the normal children's home because they present a great deal of problems. Special schools find them extremely difficult to handle.
Well, everything's all very quiet this morning.
The standard of childcare at Kendal House is high. The staff include nurses, teachers and social workers, all trained to cope with particularly disruptive children.
What sorts of incidents are you dealing with? What sorts of behaviour?
Well, general difficult behaviour. As I say, we get a lot of manipulation because children have learnt to manipulate a situation. So we get all the normal acting out behaviour of children in school, tipping up desks, throwing their books on the floor, running from the classroom, that sort of thing. They've also learnt, you know, to swear and carry on at staff. And so, again, they try that on. So you get the sort of general difficult behaviour, which your just has got to help them face up to, that they can't live like this. But we also get children who are extremely aggressive, who go into sort of frenzied aggression and don't know really what they're doing.
The concern about Kendal House is over the type of medical treatment sometimes prescribed by the home's consultant psychiatrist, Dr. Perrin Panayagam.
What about you? You've been with us for 3 months.
Yeah.
And what was the feelings you had when you first came in here?
I was frightened at first.
Yes.
But then after quite a while I got settled in.
You settled in. And do you think you have improved?
Yeah.
In what?
Of the 12 girls in Kendal House at the moment, 4 are being given drugs. This girl, who's been at the home for over 5 years, was abandoned by her mother, who simply returned to Nigeria without her. The girl is severely emotionally disturbed, and she suffers from epilepsy, for which she also has to be treated. According to Miss Law, she's built up such a tolerance to drugs that on the day we filmed, she'd been given enough to knock an adult on his back.
In spite of being on the medication you're having, you find you can concentrate at school?
Yeah, it's not...
And you can take part in the sports activities and trampolining?
Yeah, except for now I get a bit sleepy in the afternoons.
I see. Yes. We deal here with severely disturbed children, manifesting aggressive behavior, absconding, having stolen things from shops, and suicidally depressed children. And these are children who have not had a happy emotional background and hence are emotionally deprived. And hence, the behavior they exhibit are antisocial behavior patterns, and having been let down by their parents, they come in a scarred, personality-wise way, and trying to establish relationships with adults whom they could eventually trust.
Would you describe them as being mentally ill?
I would prefer to use the word emotionally ill, and by that I mean displaying serious depression, anxiousness with tension, and irritability. And these are the common patterns.
For some of them, though not all, there is some medication.
For a few of them, especially those children who show serious depressive pictures, because when they are seriously depressed, they find it very difficult to concentrate and benefit from psychotherapy. Apart from psychotherapy, they find it very difficult to concentrate in school. Hence, the importance of helping the depression.
And what sorts of medication are we talking about here, then?
The very safe medications, they are called tricyclic antidepressants, and triptizol is one of them. And they usually have this in the evening before they go to sleep, because then they don't have side effects the next day. And they get this medication for anything from 3 to 6 months, after which it is weaned off.
Our inquiries have shown that some children who've been treated by Dr. Perrin Panayagam were on drugs over a much longer period. Pamela Butcher spent 3 years in Kendal House. She was still on drugs when she left, and she says that she and the other girls who were under medication as well did suffer serious side effects.
Some of them had the same problem as me of always being tired. Some of them had other problems with their eyes. I did at one stage have that problem myself, where they thought I needed glasses. They had my eyes tested, and the optician eventually said it was the drugs that I was being given at the home was affecting my eyes. Some of them used to make me really tired, permanently tired. However I seemed to go to bed at night, I seemed to still be tired in the morning, and I'd sleep in the day. And on one particular sort, that I don't remember what they were called, I was asleep nearly all the time on them.
Are you able to give any indication of how successful your work here has been?
Well, we have had instances of children who have been here who have come back to us and visited and holding jobs, living independently, a thing which they could never have done had they not had the 3 or 4 years at Kendal House.
The case of another girl who was in Kendal House at the same time as Pamela is now causing more widespread concern. The girl, called Yvonne, was taken into care by the London Borough of Brent when she was only 10 years old.
What sort of girl was Yvonne?
She was quite small, of mixed parentage, very intelligent, and I suppose she could be described as hyperactive. She posed quite a lot of problems for staff because of her unwillingness at times to cooperate with us.
What was her background? Why was she taken into care?
I think that she initially came into care because her mother had other children, younger children, and she found the demands which Yvonne made upon her much too much to cope with. And I think she came to the social services and asked for help. She had several periods with us in the assessment centre. A number of placements were tried, ranging from children's homes. She was found to be too difficult for children's homes. At some stage she was sent to a school for girls, and there they found that they couldn't contain her. She was often running away, committing minor offences.
Then, in October 1975, Yvonne was sent to Kendal House.
Oh yes, Yvonne came to us from a very seriously deprived background and lacking any proper parental standards to mould her life by. Hence, she displayed very serious, aggressive, homicidal behaviour, which became apparent from time to time here in Kendal House, and we had to use a preparation to help her to overcome the aggression.
Which would be what?
In her case, it was Modicate. And this certainly effectively helped her over this period, and she was able to relate to the others and learn better.
In that particular case, then, you were having to use Modicate to control her behaviour.
I would say to control her serious homicidal behaviour.
As I understand it, she had spoken later to social workers and said that if she misbehaved, then at that time she would be given injections or tranquilizers of some form.
I wouldn't agree with that. I don't think just for misbehaving she was given an injection, far from it. If she had hurt somebody seriously and she had displayed antisocial behavior by destruction and smashing up, that sort of thing, then, having tried to advise her to calm down, if she continued to exhibit that behavior, that was when an injection would be given.
Just over a year after Yvonne first went to Kendal House, she spent Christmas at the Brent Assessment Centre. Alan Clark noticed she'd changed dramatically.
At first I didn't recognise her. She was not the same child. She was zombie-like, hands trembled. She was so docile, which was in total opposition to what we had seen from her before. She was with us a few days, and we were required to administer a number of pills. The doses were stated on the respective bottles. We were given no information about what these pills were for or what they would do. And as I remember it, the three drugs concerned was a substance called camcolite, another called artane, and a third called modicate. And as I remember, the doses of two of these, the camcolite and the modicate, were quite significant.
Were you happy that she was taking drugs like that?
Well, initially we didn't know what the drugs were for. When she began to fall asleep in the middle of the day, she seemed to be quite unable to understand what was being said to her. Most of the time when she was awake, she had a sickly grin on her face. This was totally alien to the personality that we had known, and it worried me so much that I telephoned a psychiatrist who was our consultant at that time and asked him what the drugs were and what sort of effect they would have on her. And he did agree that these particular drugs were very powerful sedatives and could be responsible for her condition. He also explained that one of the drugs was to stop the trembling of the hands, which we'd noticed as a very marked symptom of her condition. That trembling at times was so bad that she couldn't hold a cup.
Dr. Colin Brewer saw Yvonne after she'd been at Kendal House for 3 years. We asked him what, in his opinion, Yvonne had been treated for.
That's a very good question. She was clearly not suffering from any disorder like schizophrenia. I saw no evidence while she was here, or evidence from her notes that she was suffering from, say, a manic depressive disorder. So I'm forced to the conclusion that her disease, that her disorder, was simply that she was rather stroppy. That's putting it mildly. She was very stroppy. And the drugs were either being used simply as a chemical restraint, as chemical imprisonment, and indeed they were undoubtedly being used in very large doses, so large, in fact, that were it not for the fact that the same dosage appears in her notes so frequently, I would have thought that there must be a misprint, that there must have been a typing mistake.
Is she ill? I mean...
Ill in the sense that she was displaying serious, aggressive, antisocial behavior that we would not see in a child who would have had a better upbringing and a better chance in life to mould her standards by.
As well as being chairman of Brent's Social Services Committee, you are a doctor and you've seen Yvonne's medical file. What was she actually suffering from?
Well, this, in fact, I, in fact, don't know, and from what I can understand, the consultant psychiatrist in question doesn't like to label the children he's looking after. And one can accept that. I mean, I'm not going to disagree with how he might decide whether he wants to label a particular child's condition or not.
But you're saying there's no clear diagnosis on the records?
No.
Whether or not Yvonne's treatment at Kendal House was justified, it does not seem to have solved her problems. After 3 years, she was sent to the St Charles Youth Treatment Centre in Essex, a national unit run directly by the Department of Health and Social Security for some of the country's most disturbed and delinquent teenagers. Last September, Yvonne and another 15-year-old took over the kitchen there and held the staff at bay with knives. It took police with riot shields to get them out.
Are you satisfied with the standard of care that she's had during her time in the care of Brent?
I think one would like to... I think it's... To say yes, I think, would basically be untrue, given what has happened in this particular case.
As a result of our inquiries into Yvonne's case, the Department of Health and Social Security is being asked to investigate Dr. Perimpanaigam's methods of treatment at Kendal House.
We in Brent have asked the DHSS if in fact they would look into what happens at Kendal House in regard to the question of the use of drugs, to see whether it's something that ought to be done or not. I think what one would hope is that out of this there would come a general inquiry whereby the whole question would be broached on a much wider nature than it possibly has in the past, as to whether drugs really do have a part to play in the treatment of children.
Because of Yvonne's case, Brent Council are reviewing whether or not they'll continue to send children in their care to Kendal House. Kensington and Chelsea Council have also decided to act on the question of the use of drugs. As a result of recent cases not just involving Kendal House, they're drawing up a list of the drugs which must not be used on their children without the Council's specific consent. Many people who have to deal with severely disturbed children would welcome the introduction of clear guidelines on when drugs should be used. The difficulty is that the Department of Health and Social Security do not keep any statistics on where, when and how often powerful drugs are used on children in care. Other experts on childcare, however, feel that simply drawing up guidelines to control the use of drugs misses the point. They say you just can't treat delinquency.
If in fact the condition was susceptible to treatment, it might be easier to argue for a treatment-based approach. Now, there is not one jot of evidence that juvenile delinquency is in any way susceptible to any form of treatment. So you do wind up with a very, very unjust situation in which youngsters are sent for indeterminate periods of time to forms of treatment which frankly don't work.
Even if the use of drugs on disturbed children was banned, except where there was a specific mental disorder, the problem of what to do with them would of course remain. Colin Brewer believes there are alternatives.
I would certainly lock the doors every time. I think that if the only alternative to locking the doors is in effect to lock up their minds, surely most people would agree that it is better to lock the door and try and do something to the mind within that secure environment. And in my experience of asking the children themselves which they prefer, that is what they would want too.
One place that does lock the doors, rather than use drugs on its problem children, is the St Charles Youth Treatment Centre. The high security and intensive staffing required in places like St Charles are extremely costly.
Hello, girls. This morning we're going to do some English now, so will you turn to page...
And an increasing number of professionals believe there's a cheaper and more effective way of coping with severely disturbed children. They argue that many of these children needn't be either drugged or locked up. Instead, they should be looked after outside in the community.
How many usages are there of the word there, do you think?
Over the past 5 years, Kent County Council have been putting this idea to the test.
For the past 5 years, we've been trying to disprove the statement that a large number of English children are unsuitable for fostering. As it doesn't appear to be true in some other countries, I didn't see why it had to be true in England. So we picked what was supposed to be the most difficult group to foster, 14 to 17 years old with severe problems. And we've placed altogether 156 up to last August when we counted. And on 2 separate evaluations, it looks like over 70% of them improved during the period they're placed.
Pamela Butcher was one of those fostered through the Kent scheme. She was placed with a Blacker family in 1976 after 3 years in Kendal House. No one pretends that life with her new family was easy.
She was very, very noisy. You could see her working up to a dramatic situation and absolutely nothing would stop her. You could sidetrack her, but you were only postponing the inevitable. She would eventually blow completely, and then she would either attack one of the kids or chuck things about or make a lot of noise, stamping, rushing backwards and forwards through a room, slamming doors, any kind of attention, getting very hysterical, violent sort of behaviour.
So how did you cope with that?
Well, we tried everything we could think of, from quiet reason to putting her on the floor and sitting on her.
What's surprising is that the Kent project has had little difficulty in finding families willing to take young people like Pamela. After nearly 2 years, the Blackers had done enough to give Pamela a new start in life. She met and married Brian, and her relationship with the Blackers is now that of any young adult with her family. She's a regular and a welcome visitor.
Well, what has happened to her, I think, is that she now believes in herself. She has self-opinion. She's discovered that she is an individual person, that she can make her own way in life. And, of course, Brian has been a magic thing to happen to her because he is her own person who loves her absolutely for herself and for no other reason.
How much does fostering cost compared to the cost of residential care?
Considerably less, although our kind of fostering is deliberately expensive. We regard one placement as equivalent of a half-time social work job in your own home, and 2 placements as equivalent to a full-time social work job in your own home. For that reason, we pay a professional fee of £45 a week, which is taxable, plus the maintenance-only boarding out rate on top of it, which comes together to just under £60 a week. But when you think of community homes and education, you get into figures like over £200 a week, and if you look at secure units, you get into figures like £490 a week, really big money.
Are there children who can't be fostered?
Well, I suppose there are, but I'm not at all clear who they are.
More and more councils may eventually follow Kent's example and find foster parents for severely disturbed children like Pamela. Already there are 30 similar experimental schemes in other parts of the country. But in the short term, local authorities are bound to go on placing such children inside institutions.
Pamela's case raises the important question of whether or not we ought to be looking after many of Britain's severely disturbed children who are now being treated with drugs in a more natural and less expensive way. As we saw in the film, the Department of Health and Social Security is now being asked to investigate this issue. And earlier this week, I interviewed a junior minister at the department, Sir George Young, to see what he and his colleagues were going to do. We'll be back with what he had to say in just a minute.
Part 2 of the London programme, Children in Care, production number 20004, date recorded 17th of January 1980, take 1.
Sir George, the Minister for Health said last spring that in the Year of the Child we ought to take a long, hard look at how we treat our problem children. You've had 3/4 of the Year of the Child in office. What are your conclusions about the particular problem of heavy prescription of tranquilizers and other drugs to these very disturbed minority children?
I think this is a very difficult question. My own view is that advance in drugs has enabled a lot of people who would otherwise have been in institutions for the whole of their lives to return to the community. And I think that there is a role for drugs in treating some of the children that we've looked at. But the actual decision of what to prescribe and for how long is, of course, a clinical decision that should be taken by a doctor. And I think one has to make it clear that the doctor owes his allegiance to the child that he is treating, not to the institution that he's in or the people running it.
Some of the people we've talked to felt that there ought to be some guidelines from the department, not, if you like, compulsory, not interfering with the clinical freedom of the doctor, but giving the individual doctor the benefit of what's known about the possible dangers of prescribing drugs for a very long period of time, for example.
I think many doctors would welcome guidance. I'm not sure that it would be right for me or my colleagues as politicians to do this, I would see such guidance coming from, for example, the Royal College of Psychiatrists, whom we've alerted about this programme. And if they feel that something is wrong, if they feel there's a genuine debate about whether certain drugs should be prescribed, I hope that they would look into it and debate it amongst themselves. And if at the end they felt that there was a call for guidance in the interests of doctors, then that is their decision.
You say you would hope. I mean, but is this a matter of nods and winks, or are you actually setting up some kind of an inquiry into this?
No, we're not setting up an inquiry. We have notified the Royal College of Psychiatrists of this programme, asked them to watch it. And I don't think it would really be right for politicians to intervene in what is really a matter of clinical judgment.
And most of the homes where these children are subject to one form of inspection or another. Some are inspected, as I understand it, by the department, others by local authorities. Do you think it would be possible to suggest to inspectors, starting with the department's own inspectors, that they actively look out for cases where drugs are being used not for the child's benefit, but to make life easier for the staff?
Well, I think you've missed out a very important safeguard that already exists. The children that you've looked at are children in the care of local authorities, and they are responsible. And it's up to each local authority to make sure that the child is getting the right treatment. And if they felt, for example, that the treatment they were getting in a particular home was wrong, they're quite entitled to call for a second opinion. And if they want, they can take the child away and place the child somewhere else. So that is an important safeguard.
It sounds to me a little bit as though you're saying that national politicians can't interfere in clinical matters, but local politicians and councils can.
No, I'm saying that the children already have legal guardians who are responsible and answerable to the courts for their well-being.
I'd like just to talk about the alternatives. Some people feel that we are too squeamish about locking children up, and that is why, as an alternative, doctors sometimes use drugs when perhaps they don't really need to, and when it's perhaps not really in the child's interest. How do you feel about that?
I'm not sure that they are alternatives. Locking up a child is something which would be done by the people running the home, or could be done. Prescribing can only be done by a doctor, so I don't really see them as alternatives.
Well, I think the theory is that in certain difficult circumstances, the people running the home come to the doctor and say, for heaven's sake, give us something to quieten this child down.
Well, in that case, the doctor should only give treatment if it really is in the child's interests and if the child knows what is happening. And I think it would be wrong, actually, to rely on drugs to make the staffing of the home more easy, or to enable it to be run with fewer staff. I think that would be a misuse.
The other alternative, which many of the people we talk to think very highly of, is the alternative of developing fostering schemes like the one in Kent. Do you think that can be an alternative to the use of drugs in these cases?
I don't think it's an alternative necessarily to the use of drugs. It's an alternative to putting children in institutions. It's an option which the government is in favour of. And in a whole range of fields, we're trying to get people out of institutions back into the community. We're very interested in what's going on in Kent. And I hope that other local authorities will try and find foster parents who can tackle this very challenging job. And I think there is a role to play here. Nonetheless, I think there will always be a hard core of children that it would be unreasonable to expect a couple on their own to look after. Some children have been unable to be controlled in community homes with quite a large number of staff. And I think in those circumstances, foster parents couldn't cope. But yes, there is scope for progress here, and we're very anxious to encourage it.
So it seems that the Department of Health and Social Security is keen to develop alternative ways of looking after problem children in care. But it's going to wait to see whether or not the Royal College of Psychiatrists feels that there's a need for guidelines on the use of drugs. If it does feel that, then the whole issue may be looked into by the government. That's all for tonight, so until next week, from all of us at the London programme, good night.